Good afternoon, and my name is Volker Finkheuer. I'm the Director General from the European Commission, responsible for environment. And I'm extremely pleased to have you here with this event, which is about water-sensitive pathways to energy transition. And this water-energy nexus is something that is emerging, I think also during this COP, but also probably at future COPs and also at the biodiversity COP that comes. Why is it emerging also for us? This is an event hosted by the European Commission and the European Union, because drought is very much on our mindset now as well, because we had experiences, really an uncomfortable reality with drought mounting even in Europe to an unprecedented scale. But when you talk about drought, it almost has immediately an impact on water and therefore also this nexus with energy, because our rivers run dry and we had not enough water to cool some of our, let's say, nuclear installations or to work on the hydrogen power plants, who had to go down and produce less. And that was something absolutely new, because we had too little water or too warm water. And that, of course, happens at the time when, because of the war in Russian war in Ukraine, energy is really the big thing and the big threat and the big challenge for everybody. Now we have key technologies to reach our climate neutrality goals, like renewable hydrogen, as I said, but they need not less water, they need a lot of water and energy. And there you have the perfect nexus, water-energy nexus. And this is a dilemma. And I think on this we have three speakers. Two are really also very experts. One is more from the political side, and we want to hear from them what are the challenges, how can we have pathways, how can we meet that, and what is needed in order to turn it around. And I would start with, we are very honored to have you here with us, with His Excellency Professor Hani Svillam, who is the Minister for Water Affairs and Irrigation of the Arab Republic of Egypt. But he has also a very, very long and very impressive career as a professor of hydrology and water resource management. So you really know as a minister what you're talking about. And you worked as the managing director of the UNESCO chair in hydrological changes and water resource management at the Aachen University in Germany. And you were also at the university delegate for African countries. I could go on, but you really have a very impressive academic career, but also political career. But this year, you were also awarded the 2022 Water Energy Food Ecosystem Nexus Award by the EU-supported Partnership for Research and Innovation in the Mediterranean area, known as PRIMA. So feel free to enlarge the water-energy nexus to food if you want. But in any case, Minister, you can take the floor now, and please go to the lectern. Thank you very much for being with us. Not too much, but definitely first up to 10 minutes.
Okay. So good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy actually to speak here, and once you put the topic in front of me, I forget the politician, attitude and language, and then I go directly to the tinkle. But I will try to balance today. So the issue with the water energy nexus is actually becoming more and more important. But if we try to see it, if we are serious about achieving the SDGs, I think if you try to exclude any of the 17 SDGs that you say, okay, it's not related to water and energy, it's going to be very difficult to find any one of them that's not directly or indirectly related to water. And if not water, then it's energy. And if it's not energy, then it's food. That's why I was asking whether I should bring also food into the equation. So that we have to consider. I mean, we have to consider the interrelationship between water, energy, and food. Because if we want to achieve the zero hunger, we have to have intensive and more sustainable agriculture and food production. And this needs water security. To have the food security, you need water security. And today, with the water scarcity, and you were speaking about drought and scarcity, there is no chance to have more and more water resources and new resources without having energy. Because if you speak about water treatment, if you speak about water desalination, they are super intensive energy consuming technologies. So achieving the hunger, zero hunger, it needs water, energy, and food. So that's one example. But we can go on and on to the 17s. I don't think I have the time for that. But that's why we say at the global level, we have to think about this nexus very serious. If we go to a regional level, so we take, for example, a transboundary river as an example. If you see, you have many examples on Earth that we build dams to generate hydropower using this also connection, this water energy nexus. And I can give example here in the region for the upstream of the Nile, that it's also here that if you build a dam to generate hydropower with all the ecological consequence, you also have to consider that the downstream countries are interested to use the same water for producing food. And this is another dimension of the water energy food nexus that has to be considered at the regional and the transboundary level. Because at the end, it has to be not only the nexus in the terms of technical connections, but also nexus in terms of we to be connected and to have a win-win approaches and solutions. And when you come to the national level, I think each country and each politician is interested to secure the water. And always in Egypt, for example, when we speak about water security, we always go to today with the water poverty reaching 500 cubic meter per capita per year, which means we are missing almost 50% of the water needed for the population. And we still, with the same amount of water that we used to manage when the population in Egypt in the 60s was slightly above the 20 million inhabitants, we had the 55.5 billion cubic meter. Today, in 2022, we are 104 million inhabitants, which means that we are increasing fourfold and we're still living with the same water. So if we think about new resources, as I said before, you have to afford the energy to secure your water. And that brings me to the last layer. And I think this layer that, as you mentioned, I was receiving the award this morning about the technology that we produced during my time at the university, which is really looking at the future. When I was thinking what's left for us in the region, a water scarce region, the Middle East, or some of the African countries, you find always the three S, the sun, the sand, and the seawater. That's what is existing, and plenty of it. And you have to find a way to produce food out of the sun, sand, and the salty water, the three S I mentioned. And that's why it was very important, the movement. So I'm not very negative about focusing on energy in the previous COPs and delaying the water a little bit. It's okay, but we cannot delay the water more. That is the time that we have to think about water and making use of the revolution that, if I can call it, happening in the energy in the previous years. Let me come to the point, the energy, I take photovoltaic, for example, as an example here. The price of kilowatt hour of the photovoltaic has reduced by 90% only over 10 years. And if we speak about desalination, maybe for some of you it's not very interesting technology, but for a region like where we are now, it is the hope for all of us. This is the hope that we will have new resources, but how can we make it efficient, cheap, and sustainable at the same time? Because desalination, as it looks like today, it's not a green technology and it's not sustainable technology because of the byproduct that I don't want to go in more technical details. But the cost of desalination, 50% of it is an energy cost, which means the revolution happened in the energy will help us a lot to reduce the price of desalinated water, and it will enable us in the near future, if we focus now on water, to secure our food from the desalinated water. And there are technologies, and I think there are many scientists moving in this direction. And I think we, as a politicians, and I'm very happy now to have this position, because I see the problem from the technical perspective, and I will do my best to support, but I always will have with us, always the European Commission and the friends and the colleagues and all the agencies and international organizations. And I highly appreciate the role of the European Commission and the European Union here in Egypt in terms of projects, support, funding, activities to support scientists. And I think we all should focus now on water, making use of the revolution happened in the energy to secure our food in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And also by making very clear that if we go away from the dependency from fossil fuels and we go into renewables, a lot of the renewables need really a lot of water. So we cannot, overlook that nexus between water and energy. Thank you very much for that. And I would now ask Commissioner Sinkevicius from the European Commission to take the floor. He is a commissioner for both the water as well, because you are for environment, but also fisheries and oceans. So you can combine in your political portfolio all the three elements. Please take the floor from the lantern if you can. Just to say, while he is taking his stand, he was also the Minister for Economy in Lithuania, and before leading the Committee of Economy in the Lithuanian Parliament. So I've seen it from different angles, so also very much this nexus, not only from the energy and environmental and water nexus, but also from the economic one. Please, Commissioner, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. And of course, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for being here today. Thank you very much for the excellent speech. And really, I'd like to start by thanking Egypt and, of course, as a presidency of COP27 for their focus on climate adaptation and on water in particular. It's a hugely important topic, and as Minister Professor, he referred to food. I would say that everything comes back to water, sooner or later, but very often. And it's unfortunately been absent from the climate COP's agenda for some years now. So it's extremely important that it's back. The figures that we have, they are quite terrifying. According to UN, water, 2.3 billion people all around the world live in water-stressed countries. And 733 million of them live in countries that suffer from high or critical water stress. As we all know, these numbers will increase as the impacts of climate change, they just continue to grow. And by 2050, drought could affect more than 75% of world's population. Between 4.8 and 5.7 billion people could live in areas that suffer from water shortages for at least 1 month a year. And anything up to 216 million people could be displaced from their home, at least partially due to prolonged spells of dry weather. So now, right now, water is an increasingly scarce resource, and not just because of climate change. Socioeconomic pressures, such as growing populations, resource-intensive developments, also have a significant role to play. As usual, it is less wealthy communities and peoples who suffer the most, with women especially being affected. Water scarcity is also a root cause of conflict and of population movements. At the same time, as global energy consumption continues to grow, more than 900 million people are still lacking access to energy, and that's 13% of the global population. And this is a key global challenge, and it will be extremely vital to ensure a universal access to energy sources that are sustainable and renewable. in a context of scarce resources. So we actually face two huge development challenges: water and energy. And both are deeply connected. I would like to take Europe as example. Last summer in Europe, we saw the consequences of drought for our energy system. So hydro, nuclear power plants had to reduce their production due to water scarcity, or water temperatures, they were just too high. And this happened in the middle of energy supply, and energy prices were provoked to spike by the Russia's unjustified and unprovoked war in Ukraine. And if you look around the globe, many countries are familiar with these problems in Africa and around the Mediterranean, for instance. But these challenges and comparatively new, they are comparatively new in Central and Northern Europe, which have traditionally been water rich and didn't really bring this question to the agenda. To be perfect honest with you, in Europe we are still on a steep learning curve and have to do much more and better to reflect interlinkages between water and energy in our EU policies. We already had sustainability criteria for bioenergy to reduce its negative impacts on land use, biodiversity, carbon sinks, but we hardly had anything similar for water in our energy policies. And this despite a very robust set of laws for water that have existed in the EU for several decades. And I can see the very similar situation across the globe. And yet it's clear that the interdependence of water and energy is only set to intensify in the near future. The implications for energy and water security, they are going to be significant. And apart from integrating the interplay between energy and water into our policies for climate adaptation, we also need to design strong and resilient mitigation policies, and notably in the field of energy, first of all. Water is a necessity, and not only for adaptation, but for mitigation reasons as well. Typically, fossil fuels are more water intensive than renewables, but some renewables, low carbon technologies like hydropower, nuclear and bioenergy are also water dependent. So the same can be said about renewable hydrogen and carbon capture, which again, many people consider to be crucial key components in a climate neutral future. 1 kilo of green hydrogen requires around 20 liters of fresh water. And the water sector is also a major user of energy. It represents around 4% of the global energy consumption, according to International Energy Agency. So how can we address and go ahead with the intertwined water energy crisis? Solutions do exist. And first of all, circular economy and resource efficiency, with prevention at its core. Defining the right energy mix is key for low carbon and water resilient energy systems. We need to stimulate water efficiency and water reuse across the whole life cycle of processes and products. And there are many examples of these win-win circular approaches that are already out there. So you can integrate water reuse and water efficiency into policies for energy efficiency. You can implement nature-based solutions and approaches based around urban greening. And you can use approaches that are even more innovative still, like energy recovery from wastewater treatment and irrigation systems. And let me give you 2 examples of how we try to implement these win-win circular approaches within the European Union. So the first is a recent proposal to revise our major piece of legislation for wastewater treatment. I'm sure you know that wastewater treatment is one of the biggest consumers of energy in the public sector. And our aim is, of course, to tackle that issue head on and aim for energy neutrality for the sector by 2040. The idea is to get there by reducing energy use and by using the large surfaces of some wastewater treatment plants to produce solar or even wind energy by encouraging water reuse, and then by using sludge to produce biogas, which we can use as substitute for a natural gas. The second is another piece of legislation that is already in place and will take effect in the summer, and it's called Water Reuse Regulation. And the aim is to boost supply for specific purposes by using alternative sources of water. So the regulation seems quite simple. It sets out minimum quality standards and monitoring requirements to ensure safe water reuse for agricultural irrigation. And these two legislative instruments are powerful, but very clearly that's not going to be enough. We also need water-intensive investments. In practice, that of course means that energy investments take water availability into account with a very well-known principle for us: do no harm. And first of all, do no harm approach to water supply, especially where vulnerable populations are concerned. And of course, we also need to invest more in water-efficient technology. I think we all agree on the need for a green transition. So water and energy will both play an essential role, and it will be crucial to ensure that this transition for all is fair, a broad social transition, and not just changes for the lucky few ones. Next year, we're going to have a unique opportunity. Next year, we're going to have a UN 2023 Water Conference, and that's going to be an important event to discuss these challenges in a greater detail and to look and zoom in more closely at possible solutions. But there is no reason, of course, to wait for 2023. I'm sure that my fellow speakers and panelists today will bring further detail and analysis of water energy solutions with their pros and cons and how to integrate them into policies and investment strategies. Of course, I look forward to these discussions. This is clearly a global conversation, and it's only just a beginning. Water and energy affect us all. As I began, I'm very thankful to Egypt for really spotting this opportunity and returning back it to the climate COP, because water and energy are very close and they are in the center of the transition which we are discussing this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for sharing some concrete examples how the European Union is now starting to address this water energy nexus in the face of drought, and while phasing out from fossil fuels into scaling up very much rapidly into renewables. And we have all high hopes in sharing experiences with all other countries in New York. But let me turn to the last keynote speakers. It's Mary Warlick, Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. And while she's already taking her pace there, I would like to briefly introduce her because she's a very impressive career diplomat, or had it as a past, and she was also the US ambassador in Serbia. But you have held very senior leadership positions, I must say, at the US Department of State, National Security Council, and Department of Defense, and also, of course, in the energy area. So probably you might also want to bring in a little bit that security nexus as well. So please, you take the floor.
Well, thank you very much, and sorry for jumping the gun. I know we're running a little short on time, so I'll try to be relatively brief. And let me just say thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you today for this really important discussion on the water energy nexus and the energy transition. And I really just would like to begin by saying a thank you, of course, Mr. Minister, to you for all the great work that you are doing and for hosting this COP here in Sharm-el-Sheikh these 2 weeks. Thank you also, Mr. Commissioner, for the leadership that you're providing on this issue. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Fatih Birol, and all of us at the IEA, I really want to say a big word of thanks to the Directorate General for the Environment at the European Commission, and to you in particular, Director General Finkoyer, for your leadership and for guiding the European Commission's work on this topic. So just to say, the IEA has been looking at the water energy nexus for a number of years now. And of course, much has changed since the landmark World Energy Outlook special report on this topic was first released in 2016. Water and energy underpin economic and social development, as has already been mentioned, and water is needed for each stage of energy production, and energy is crucial for the provision and treatment of water. The interdependency has significant implications for both energy and water security. And with both water and energy needs set to very much increase in the coming years, we need to understand the linkages between the two to anticipate future stress points and to implement policies, technologies, and practices that soundly address the associated risks. And what's more, with the linkages between water and energy, they are intensifying. The energy sector's water consumption keeps rising, underpinned by an increase in biofuels production, fossil fuel developments, and particularly in 2022, a rise in coal power generation. So our need for water is also getting more energy intensive. Water stress has been increasing on a global level, leading to more desalination projects, large-scale water transfer, and increasing energy demand to wastewater treatment. Supplying oil, natural gas, coal, and the critical minerals used in the energy sector requires literally billions of cubic meters of water each year. And water is used along the entire supply chain, from exploration to processing and transport, as well as in many standard operations such as cleaning, cooling, dust control, and pumping. And among critical minerals, copper and lithium are particularly vulnerable to water stress given the location of mines and their high water requirements. In fact, over 50% of today's lithium and copper production is concentrated in areas with high water stress levels, such as northern Chile or Australia, and this proportion is set to increase. So climate change is likely to further alter precipitation and runoff, increase variability in stream flow, and raise water temperature. And these climate impacts in water directly affect energy supply and demand. Changes in water availability will alter generation output and the potential of hydropower plants. And limited availability of cooling water can lead to partial output reduction or complete shutdown of thermal power plants that use fresh water as a coolant. More prolonged or frequent droughts in some countries can lead to a higher energy demand for potable water and irrigation. And accelerating decarbonization is crucial to ensure that climate change is mitigated, but at the same time, we need to build and strengthen the climate resilience of energy systems. Climate change is putting global energy security at risk, as we've seen in the case of severe droughts in Chile and elsewhere. And while these impacts vary significantly from country to country, all regions really around the world are subject to the impacts of climate change, as we know. In locations with increased risk of water scarcity, the application and development of new energy technologies, such as hydrogen or carbon capture and storage, may be constrained due to the additional water demand they add to water basins. Policies and technologies already exist that can help ease choke points and reduce demand in both sectors, meaning that water does not have to be a limiting factor for the energy sector, and a rise in water demand does not have to be accompanied by an equal rise in energy demand. Policy efforts can strive for a sustainable management of water resources through an integrated approach that manages water systems at a basin level and involves multiple stakeholders in coordination efforts. And regulations should implement policies sooner rather than later to avoid the risk of water resources being overexploited and energy systems damaged before policy measures come into effect. So we hope that IEA analysis can support the discussions on this really important topic at this COP and beyond. And on behalf of the IEA, I'd really like to express once more our deep appreciation to my fellow speakers, all the organizers, to the audience gathered here today for this discussion on how we can better manage the water energy nexus. And we very much look forward to continued collaboration and cooperation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mary, also for bringing the EIA's perspective and this security nexus. I'm very afraid we are running short of time, but in order to at least get our audience a little bit energized here, who thinks, because you come from different countries here, water, energy, food nexus will also become a security long-term issue? Please raise your hands, just to get an idea. I even say it for Europe. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry for that, for not being able to give you the floor for some questions, but I would still like to have time for our panel, and therefore I would, with a big thank you and applause, dismiss our keynote speakers, and I hope, to be honest, that our panelists are here, because if not, you have time for questions. Okay, please. Then thank you very much once again for bringing and setting the scene. And as we are now changing a little bit, please sit next to me. And hi, I was looking for you. So both of you. And as we, yes, and as we now go to the panel section of this event on water-sensitive pathways to energy transition, let me please introduce our two panelists. On my left is Mrs. Eva Meyerhofer, and she's the head of the Environment Policy Unit in the Sustainability and Quality Management Department and the lead biodiversity specialist in the European Investment Bank. And we work a lot with the European Investment Bank, and you are really leading, actually, the EIB's efforts to support the EU and other international biodiversity policies. Thank you for being with us. And then I have, to my right, thank you, and we haven't met, I'm sorry I saw that before, the second panelist was Dr. Joad El-Karas, who is the Executive Director of the Regional Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, an intergovernmental organization with diplomatic status, however, based in Cairo with 17 Arab countries on board. So you really have also the policy side again and the political side and the science and the finance side, which is the most important in most of it. So I would probably start with you, Eva, because you are, let's say, representing here the EIB, which is a major investor in the energy field, at least from the European side. So can you explain a little bit, like, how does the EIB factor in water issues and the energy in your energy projects, because you're financing a lot that you're supporting? And perhaps you can give us some examples on hydropower, because this is exactly where we always think, like, this is where the water energy nexus clash. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm a bit of fish out of the water because, as you mentioned, I'm a biodiversity specialist. I'm not an energy nor a water specialist, so I'll do my very best. Yes, hydropower and energy. I mean, I think one of the biggest complications that we do have, I mean, we've heard about the need for policies, regulation, but then translating that into application is always the challenge. So when you're designing a project, looking at the feasibility studies, and one of the main issues is that most of the time these two resources, though mutually dependent, as we've seen to date, have been kept apart. So the interactions between energy and water have been considered at regional level or technology by technology level, and not in an integrated approach. And at national and an international level, energy and water systems have been developed and regulated independently. So it is really a challenge from a planning perspective to bring the two together. So often what we have also seen is that the decision-making landscape for the water energy sector nexus is shaped by political, regulatory and economic environmental and social factors, as well as available technologies. And that landscape is very much fragmented, complex, evolving, and competing at times. So for us as a financier and doing our due diligence on those projects, and especially in the hydropower sector, which is already very complex, it's important to value those externalities. The moment you start valuing those externalities and are trying to understand the negative and the positive implications of water, of the water externalities, but also of the energy externalities, then you have a better sense of the trade-offs. Then it is a matter of coordinating between the different regulators. So often the river basin management authorities are not speaking to the Ministry of Energy. So how do you bring them together? And I think what is also fundamental, it was, I think, raised by His Excellency, the Minister, was stakeholder engagement, all the stakeholders involved, and especially upstream, downstream in hydropower. If you do not have meaningful engagement with those stakeholders, in terms of hydropower, you do not have the social license to operate. So this makes it so much more complicated. It makes the planning process, it increases the length of the planning process. But if you do it right, one important factor is that these assets are built for a very long time. So you have them, 30, 40 years. So if you do not take into account water at the very beginning in that planning stage, if you do not also factor in climate, so water resources and availability, and also factor in climate considerations, you are going to have an asset that is probably not sustainable in the long run. So I think the International Hydropower Association has done tremendous strides in providing guidance also. I think multilateral development banks have looked at developing hydropower guidelines, factoring those issues, looking at it from an integrated water management perspective. I think we have very good regulation, and a very good entry point in the EU is the Water Framework Directive. And we need to just build on it and make sure that those linkages do happen. And I'm going to stop here for the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. But I hope you don't mind if I follow up on this, because you said something like trade-offs have to be made, and the view is often fragmented. But that means when you make decisions on some of your projects, you influence, by making probably also some trade-offs, you might influence then also supply chains, no? I mean, or not?
Absolutely. I mean, what you need to understand is when you look at the trade-offs, is you need to look at the significance of the trade-offs, right? There needs to be a number of red lines. The challenge is, and very much like, I like to make that in terms of the relation also to the biodiversity agenda, in terms of the modeling that you need to do, and what you need to do is what I would call cross-cutting analysis and modeling, is data. And we don't always have the data. I mean, in certain regions and certain countries, you have quite a bit of hydrological data, and I think the next panelists will certainly address that issue. But data is fundamental, and now we need to look at ways of gathering that data, useful data, relevant data, because we do have quite a bit of data, but often not very relevant to what we need to use it for, to be able to do these forecasts. And I think that's another very important point that we have learned also from the climate agenda, especially when we are doing climate risks analysis and modeling, is we can't be looking at historical data. We need to be forecasting. And if we don't start forecasting now, we will not be producing sustainable energy assets.
Yeah, because they cost a lot of money, but
Absolutely.
also they have to stay on and be sustainable.
And be sustainable, indeed.
But that meant, Dr. Jawad, I'm sorry, I introduced you, but I'm not very familiar with your organization, I have to admit. She gave already a hint by saying data, so your organization must do something with data. but 17 Arab states around. Explain what your organization is doing and how this is relevant for water energy nexus, perhaps.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I would like to just to tell you about my career, because I was moving from water to energy, and probably I don't know by hasard, but I was working for long years in France in water management projects around the Mediterranean, in particular promoting water information systems. So my colleague Eva mentioned data. Obviously, we cannot manage something that you cannot measure, or you don't have the right data. So obviously, we struggled with the Mediterranean countries to have such information system, because we find out a lot of data sometimes, but they are not connected. Every institutions or ministry have its own database, and it's an issue without mentioning the Ministry of Energy. So there is no coordination sometimes, even within the Ministry of Water. And we have some examples of Ministry of Energy and Water, and the people of water don't talk to the people of energy. So the nexus concept, when it appears officially in 2011, it became, obviously it became very popular concept. I attended a lot of conferences talking about the nexus, but now it's obviously we are talking about implementation, this COP. It's time for concrete project, concrete nexus project. So data is an issue, definitely. Governance is another issue, because it's about more coordination between different actors. So after this experience working with the ministries of water or water authorities in the Mediterranean, I moved to Oman to work as head of research at another organization. I was dealing with desalination. Obviously, desalination is a clear example of nexus. So we are using a lot of energy to desalinate either seawater or brackish water to produce fresh water. So obviously, desalination 20 years ago, it was very heavily consuming energy, consuming technology. We did a lot of progress. If you compare with 20 years ago, no way. Now we are having with RO technology less than 3.5 kilowatt hour per cubic meter. We are even having cases of 20.8 kilowatt hour per cubic meter. We are getting closer to the thermodynamic limits. Okay, so obviously this also reflects in the cost. The cost of desalinated water. We have a record in Hassian desalination plants in UAE, 0.28 cents of dollar per cubic meter. So with very competitive cost. Again, in this position, so I was dealing with Nexus a lot, because again, from the perspective of desalination, so I was involved in Nexus.
In your organization?
No, in my previous one in Oman. Now I moved to Egypt. So now the RECRE, which is the Regional Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Indeed, we support 17 member states, Arab countries, in the energy transition journey. So obviously we support policies to accelerate the energy transition, and to support the policies in energy efficiency and more deployment of renewable energy in the region. So we have obviously a very good deployment of a renewable energy project and energy efficiency project. But before giving an example, I can give you a simple example. If we don't adopt the Nexus approach, in the case of using, for example, solar PV to pump water for agriculture, sometimes some governments subsidize the farmers, give them the subsidizing to afford to use PV to use it to produce or to pump water for their crops. And they end up by overusing this PV to pump water. We end up by depleting the aquifer or the groundwater. So another issue. Then we have no water, or we have seawater intrusion. So more problems, more desalination, etc., etc. So again, the Nexus approach is not just a blah blah. It's not just a concept. It's a very, very fundamental concept that should be adopted in a way to avoid this. Energy transition that doesn't take into consideration the water. Now, the new trend is green hydrogen. So obviously, green hydrogen now, all of us probably in Europe in particular pushing for this agenda, because we are having this climate urgency. We are moving to net zero by 2050. So we need probably the green hydrogen. It looks like the solution. At level of technology, there's lots of progress to be done yet. But to produce 1 kilogram of green hydrogen, we need 9 waters of fresh water. So obviously, when you say that, a lot of people of water, especially the Mediterranean, say, what's going on? We cannot. We don't have water. We are suffering from acute water scarcity. But again, when you come back to the science, I'm originally a scientist, to research, and you find out that it's not that problematic in a way that if we use desalination of seawater, now the cost of green hydrogen production for 1 kilogram, it's around $5 to $7 per kilogram. It's expected to get to less, to like €2 per kilogram by 2030. So there is progress on the way. So the cost of desalinated water in the process of producing green hydrogen through electrolyzers is just 1% of the total cost. I mean, it will add only 0.01 or $0.02 cents to the total cost. So it's not that much issue. The issue is more how we can make electrolyzers more energy efficient, more than the use of water. So sometimes people have this tendency to just stay on the title, but it's not that problematic. I think with desalination technologies available now, obviously dealing with environmental impact and all the stuff, so we can still afford to use desalination to produce water for green hydrogen production without really, impacting the water scarcity issue.
With that, you have already, thank you. With that, you already answered my question I was wanting to put, because His Excellency, the Minister, talked about desalination, which is very prominent, but he also mentioned you have the 3S, right? You sand, sun, and what was the second? The soil. Solar, sand, and sun. And you have the seawater, you have even more. Not everybody has it. But in certain regions, this is very promising, whereas in other regions, we are embarking on hydropower, but we then realize, we have perhaps also drawbacks, which we had not factored in because of climate change and partly also biodiversity loss. The water is disappearing, so we have dilemmas. I don't know, we have a bit of time, I would say, still for some questions now, this time for the audience, in case somebody wants to put a question. We have here a very famous panelist, and I see somebody up there. Please.
Hello, thank you very much for your talks and the information that you gave us, which was very interesting. I have a question for the first speaker, because you talked about valuing the externalities and bringing them in. But you also said that sometimes you don't have very good data. And you're talking about trade-offs, which can be very hard. So how do you actually value the externalities? How do you compare the values of different externalities?
It's a good question for a bank. A very good question for a bank.
Well, it's actually mostly, yes, it's the economists that do the valuation of myself. No, that is a problem, and it's a real problem also for when you look at biodiversity and valuing ecosystems. The problem is water is a public good, right? Mm-hmm. And I do think that the cost of water today is way too low, given the scarcity and the pressures on water. So the data is, we are in a privileged situation in Europe, is that the data is there. We've got the European Environment Agency, but in others, and I take the case of one of the hydropowers we're looking at in Madagascar, we don't have the hydrological data. We don't even have the water quality data, and that makes it all the more. So what you can do is, of course, fund studies, which then delays the projects, but you need to have that data to be able then to have those transfer values. But the more difficult part is then monetizing those ecosystems, those values. So you've got costs for probably nitrogen, phosphorus. You've got so some of that, and you'll have to start using proxies. So at the moment, the science is not really there. And so you have to make certain assumptions. It's not ideal, and the best thing you can do is be conservative in your economic analysis, but also taking into account what is very important. I think it was also the commissioner who mentioned it, and the minister, is upstream downstream, and also the impact on the different stakeholders who use that water resources. Put a value to that, because that will also then give you that conservative approach and actually price it correctly. Because if you don't start pricing it correctly, you will have the trade-offs will be much greater.
But I believe also that the bank is working on precisely methodologies on how to capture natural capital, and that is one of the big issues, because nature so far is not often seen as having any value. I mean, it's not even soil is not even valued enough, and that is one of the challenges, and I think the bank is starting on that. And that's why we have to have a very integrated approach, because some would not value it at all, and others will know that it does have a huge value if you take a life cycle approach as well. Is there a second question which we could still take, and then I'm afraid we have to close? We have already, I'm getting a sign that we had to close, but that means thank you so much for being with us and for also giving us insight why this water energy nexus is so important, why it has to be integrated in the policy making, in the financing, but also in many other ways in policies that are not necessarily making that linkage. Thank you also for a wonderful audience by being patient and by also accepting not having had so much of a chance for a question. Thank you so much, and also for the technicians. Thank you.